and that we will be taking screenshots throughout the program. So I'm going to turn this over to our directors who are going to introduce our speakers. So I'm going to mute myself now, right? Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting this panel. We have four really great speakers. Kate Ridgway, who is the, and I'm looking for your official title here, Conservator for the Department of Historic Resources in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the State Archeological Conservator, sorry. And Rob Nieweg, the Vice President for Preservation Services and Outreach at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Dr. Lauranett Lee, who is currently a faculty member at the University of Richmond. And Christina Vida, who is the Elise Wright Curator of General Collections at the Valentine, which is the history museum of the city of Richmond. So first I'd like for, I guess I'll provide a little bit of background, since I know there are some people in our meeting who are not members of the Washington Conservation Guild and also not familiar with the local area around the Confederate monuments in Richmond. The monuments that we'll be talking about the most this evening will be those of Monument Avenue, which is located west of downtown Richmond, and it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. It's unusual among monuments, but not unusual among Confederate monuments, in that it honors the losers of the war rather than the winners, which is what you would expect for monuments. It exclusively honors the losers of the war, but in 1996, a statue was erected to honor Arthur Ashe, who was a local Richmond resident, and it is the only African-American statue that is located on Monument Avenue. Most of the statues were provided by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy were obviously privately providing funding, but over the years, obviously, a lot of the maintenance and preservation relates to the fact that these are located on public land, and it'll be interesting to hear from different constituencies talking about the role of the city of Richmond versus the role of the Commonwealth of Virginia, since we have people representing both of those this evening. And I am very excited to hear each person, starting with Kate Ridgway, to describe their role in working with the monuments. Kate, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. See if I can share this. Let me get, oh goodness, let me get that out of the way. Okay, hopefully, can everyone see did that come up, I hope? Belinda, no. Has my presentation come up?
Not yet, Kate.
Okay, let's try this again.
Kate, you'll probably need to choose which screen you want to share instead of sharing your whole desktop.
Yes, I am now trying to figure that out. I apologize.
Not a problem.
Cancel that.
It should. We are viewing your screen, Kate. It's just not the right window.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. I've hit the wrong one, I think. How about this one? Let's try sharing this one. Now, let's play that. Did that work?
Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. Let me close this. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So, as Belinda said, my name is Katherine Ridgway. I'm the State Archeological Conservator for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. I am mostly going to be talking about the Lee Monument on Monument Avenue because that is the monument that I am dealing with. So I'm going to start with just some basics about the Lee Monument. The cornerstone was placed in 1887, and the plinth was built, and then the monument was put on top of that pedestal in 1890. The artist is Marius Jean-Antonin Mercier, and it was made at the foundry that was owned by the Thibault brothers in Paris, France. The monument measures 61 feet from the bottom of the pedestal to the top of Lee. The granite plinth is 40 feet tall, and Lee on his horse is 21 feet tall. And the statue itself weighs 13 tons. So over time, it's not so much that the meaning of the monument changed, but that public tolerance and agreement with that meaning changed. Now we, as preservationists, are also facing a change in our perspective on vandalism and graffiti and what this means as far as the history of the monuments are concerned. It can make preservationists and conservators uncomfortable to make decisions about what is historic when the history is still being written. So with this in mind, DHR created a guidance document to help get the word out about preservation of these monuments, either in situ or at another location, and the resources that we could provide. This document includes legal issues, preservation issues, and how to access resources. In this document, we state that graffiti, in the case of the current civil unrest, is considered historic and should be documented and kept whenever possible. Any damage that does not constitute a public safety hazard should also be kept. What we're trying to avoid are situations that might cause risk to human safety and the safety of monuments. On June 4th, 2020, Governor Northam ordered the removal of the Lee Monument, which is the only monument on Monument Avenue specifically under the purview of the state. The Department of General Services hired a conservation company to perform the removal. I was asked to review the removal proposal, and then legal roadblocks brought the process to a halt. This removal process includes partially disassembling the statue. In this picture, you can see crowds waiting for the pieces of Lee to arrive. As with many monumental bronzes, Lee is constructed of many parts that were assembled on site. There's a lot of talk about a time capsule somewhere in the Lee Monument. This is part of the reason that I'll be on site if the monument is removed. The first reason is so that DHR can be ready and able to answer questions about the removal of the monument. It is likely we will get many questions about it, and we want to be prepared. Second, if there is a time capsule, then there will be a conservator on site to care for it immediately and have it taken to a lab and the content stabilized. The time capsules are frequently compromised over time, and then the preservation of their contents could be more like having been buried than having been preserved in a protected environment. There will also be a paper conservator on hand to triage the paper and the books. So there's a lot about this situation that drives people who work in preservation crazy. There's a lot of sudden decision making. There's limited funding, especially because of COVID. There's limited time to plan. There's a moving definition of what's considered a problematic monument. And conservators are frequently being asked to react instead of invited to be part of that planning process. And in the case of Lee, there's been difficulty even getting contractors because there are contractors who feel that their business will suffer from having been involved in this project. Some of the side effects that from working on the monuments, first of all, you're working during COVID-19. People assume that they know your political and social beliefs. You can be the target of hate crimes. There's a risk of working in the midst of civil unrest. And all of this is caused to be stressed out. You have an unpredictable schedule because you have to be ready to go when the opportunity presents itself. So there's a certain need for mental care, and you have to watch out for burnout. This is not my normal job, and so constantly thinking about monuments can cause you to kind of burn out. The things that I've found helpful are making sure I have a go bag that includes not only the stuff I need for the monument, but PPE for dealing with COVID-19. I try to be clear with people that I'm doing my job, and I try to help them understand what we're doing and how that can help them deal with the situation. I try to stay neutral as much as I can because I work for the Commonwealth. I protect myself from being identified while working on monuments and other things in Richmond. I make sure that there's protection for the crew that's working on monuments because we really don't know what is going to happen when Lee comes down. And I try to take time to take care of myself so that I can reduce my stress and prevent burnout. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your questions. Let me stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Kate. And I wanted to let people know, if you have questions during the program, that you can use the email address that is in your invitation that contained the Zoom link. There should be an email address that you can use to send a message if you'd like to send a message anonymously. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand at the bottom of your screen. You should have a raise hand icon, and you can use that to alert my co-host here, Gwen Manthe, and she will make sure that your questions get to the presenters. So the next person we'd like to hear from will be Rob Nieweg from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And Rob, it says I need to ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I believe I'm unmuted. First, thank you to the Guild for the invitation to speak tonight. I come to you from Arlington, Virginia. I'm a native Virginian. I'm very proud that my daughter is living in Richmond now and that she has chosen to join some of the demonstrations regarding the monuments along Monument Avenue. So this is for me both a professional and also a personal issue. At the National Trust, where I've worked for 26 years, of key focus of our organization is to help preserve places that tell the full story of American history. And so we come to this matter with two fundamental issues. One is, how should these monuments be, how should they be treated? First question, the disposition of these monuments. And the second question is, and this is where we have put most of our energy over the years, the second question is how to increase the preservation and protection of historic places that tell African American stories in our country. So the two things I want to put on the table in these introductory remarks are, first, that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, after careful consideration, has taken a position regarding Confederate monuments. And we understand that though some Confederate monuments were established for other reasons, that most were intended to serve as a celebration of the lost cause mythology and to advance ideas of white supremacy. And that in our day, that these are abhorrent to our values. So that our position has been that removal of Confederate monuments may be necessary, is necessary, to achieve the greater good of ensuring racial justice and equality. Our public position on, our public statement on Confederate memorials is available online. For me, the heart of that statement is this, and I see this as almost a test, and that is the National Trust view, and I'll just read, the National Trust view, however, is that unless these monuments can in fact be used, first, to foster recognition of the reality of our painful past, and to invite reconciliation for the present and the future, that they should be removed. In other words, they should be removed from these public spaces unless they can be used to tell the full truth somehow, and also be used to foster reconciliation. So our organization, which we own 27 historic sites, some of which were places of enslavement. The part of the National Trust that I've been leader in is as an advocacy group. And that public statement regarding Confederate memorials, Confederate monuments, which are part of our history, but are not something we need to revere today, is the core of our advocacy position on Confederate memorials. The second thing I want to put on the table is a new tool that the National Trust has established to financially support the preservation of African American historic places. And that, again, available online, is called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. And the Action Fund has been in operation for 3 years. We've made grants to 65 projects across the country, all deeply associated with African American heritage. This year, in 2020, we awarded 27 grants for a total of $1.6 million this year. We will have another grant year next year. We give dollars in 4 categories: capital projects, programming and interpretation, organizational capacity, because we believe strongly that the preservation of African American heritage should be led by African American-led groups. And then 4th, project planning. So those 4 categories of funding. In 2020, perhaps my favorite of all the 27 grants we gave was a significant grant of about $150,000 for the restoration of for the conservation of the stained glass windows at the historic Vernon Chapel in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The raised basement structure of the Vernon Chapel is the only remaining piece of architecture after the massacre in 1921. We've also given a grant last year to help in Shacklebottom, Richmond. Because in Richmond, Virginia, former capital of the Confederacy, it's critical to offset the memorialization of the Confederacy with uplifting African American stories. So in Shacklebottom, we gave dollars, and we've advocated since 2014 for the conservation and preservation of that site. And finally, we welcome inquiries both about our public position on Confederate memorials, but also about the work we're doing to conserve and protect sites of African American significance, especially through the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And now we move along to Christina, and I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself as well.
Hi. All right, friends, my name is Christina Vida, and as Belinda mentioned, I am the Elise H. Wright Curator of General Collections at the Valentine Museum here in Richmond. We're nestled right inside VCU's medical campus. We were created as a museum in 1898, and the museum itself has witnessed the construction of most of the monuments that Richmond is now taking down, has taken down. There are still some that are remaining throughout the city. So to give a little bit of a brief context about the Valentine's involvement with the monuments in Richmond, we in 2017, soon after the events in Charlottesville, did a deep dive into the history of the city's monuments and put together a rapid response exhibit that opened in early 2018, looking at all of the monuments in the city, not just those on Monument Avenue, but really trying to give people a broader understanding of public art in the city. And that was up for about a year. And then for most of 2019, we had an exhibit up called Monument Avenue, General Demotion, General Devotion. And that was a partnership with Mob Studios and VCU to host a design competition. It was a national competition. We had about 75 submissions for what Monument Avenue could look like if it was just completely redesigned, rethought. And we displayed 20 of those and had folks come through and look at that. So we have been in it. 2020 was a complete game changer, though. And one of the reasons why for us in June of this year, as monuments started to fall, is that 2 of the monuments that have been up, I should say statues, that have been up in Richmond were crafted by Edward Virginius Valentine. He was the brother of our museum's founder, and when he passed away in 1930, he left us all of his tools, artworks that were still in his possession at the time of his death. And so we have been the caretaker of those items. And also in 1937, the city of Richmond relocated his studio about a block and a half to our campus. And I think if I share my screen now, I will be able to show y'all that studio. If I press the old F5 here. So you can see this is slowly, I am screen sharing. Here we go. Can you guys see the studio? Yes, I'm seeing nodding heads. Thank you, friends. So, so you can see the outside of this studio. We had closed the studio in March due to COVID concerns, along with the rest of the city and state, and decided, even when we reopened in July, that the current interpretation on the inside of the studio was not consistent with how the Valentines should be interpreting the story and the life and legacy of Edward Valentine. And I'm gonna show you guys an interior shot of that studio. Of course, it's a larger space. This is just one view, but you can, I think, already sort of see some problematic interpretation moments. And we have decided to completely rethink the studio space. We have also, through the City of Richmond's process, applied to receive from the city the transfer of ownership of the Edward Valentine statue of the Jefferson Davis sculpture that was a part of the Jefferson Davis monument. Here's another detail shot of all of his tools that we have in our collection. This was the last time that Jefferson Davis has been publicly photographed, on the evening of June 11th in 2020. I think you can see that he has some additional artwork applied to him. In some black paint on his face. There's a layer of pink, we believe it's latex paint, and then there's definitely spray paint underneath the pink paint. So knowing the state that the current bronze statue is in, it was also exposed to the elements since 1907 when it was erected on Monument Avenue. He has a dent. We have been able to see from videos. We know that he's got some active denting in the back of his head from where a small sedan pulled him off of his pedestal. But we would like to bring this artwork back to the Valentine Museum, if the city will give it to us, and they're working their way through their process, because we would like to interpret this statue not as a piece of 1907 artwork, but as a piece of 2020 artwork. It just so happens that we have all of Edward Valentine's materials and his sculptures, and we have a very wonderful photograph that's actually also in our collection that I think you can see here from 1907, showing him in that same position right before he's erected and put up on his pedestal. So we are hoping, we're hoping that in taking a moment, we've closed the studio. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can not look at him reposing. But we are going to, we've already hired a committee of scholars who work here locally, We've got Dr. Julian Hayter from University of Richmond, Anna Edwards, who has been closely affiliated with Shockoe Bottom. I'm glad you mentioned that, Rob. We've got Josh Epperson, who is involved with the Smithsonian Institutions, and then a wonderful VCU PhD candidate who's writing her dissertation on Edward Valentine, and her name is Kate Sunderland. And so we're working with the four of them. We're working with Valentine family members to take the next 6 months and think broadly what we want to do with the inside of the studio, knowing that we as an institution are going to continue to preserve the artistic legacy of Edward Valentine, but also want to make sure that we are contributing to the healing here in Richmond, that we are providing a space where people can have difficult conversations, where they can learn about the context in which these monuments were created, this social history, the economic history, the artistic history, and how symbolism, particularly in Edward Valentine's case, he was trained in Germany, and how German artists were using symbolism to carry their narratives, really has had a big role here in Richmond, how artists were creating symbols to really perpetrate the lost cause mythology. And continuing the era of racial oppression. So we're gonna be delving into all of that. We don't know what it's gonna look like yet. We're taking some time. We have some wonderful seed money that is contributing to that. And if the city transfers ownership of the Jefferson Davis statue, we are also going to preserve it in its current state. We've promised that to the city, but that doesn't mean we're not going to do anything to it. I'm working with a really experienced sculptor who's familiar with working in bronze and public art, and we're going to make sure that the dents that he's got are stabilized so we don't introduce bronze disease, and making sure that this object remains a legacy with so many layers of history that we can continue to interpret and engage with. So I'm looking forward to this dialogue, and I've been dying to hear from Lauranett, so I'm really excited. I'm going to pass the mic back.
Should I go ahead and start, Belinda, or is there anything you'd like to say first?
Yes, I am muted. I am not muted now. Yes, the Dr. Lauranett Lee, I'm really looking forward to hearing your historical perspective and the perspective on things that are happening with the Monument Avenue Commission since 2017. So take it away.
Thank you, Belinda, for asking me to be here today. And it's so good to be with my friends and colleagues again. It's been a while. I want to preface my remarks by including a little bit of biography. I'm a Virginian, was raised in Chesterfield, just outside of Richmond, and entered what we would call the white school in the 4th grade. Prior to that, I went to a Black school where teachers knew my parents, very close-knit environment. And so to go into the 4th grade and really a hostile environment, and be the only person of color in the class and have to endure history, the way history was taught, where slaves were happy and well taken care of. It was very difficult. That turned me off to history altogether. But eventually moving to Chicago, moving to Atlanta, I came back home with a new appreciation for history. And it's professors, the late Dr. Edgar Toppin and Ed Ayers also, that helped me see history from a different perspective. I always wanted to know, where were the Black women? They could not all have been enslaved. Where were they? That history was never told. And so now when I look at history, that's the framework that I start with. Where were the Black women? And when these monuments were mounted between 1890 and about 1925 or so, that was the height of lynching in America. And Black women also were being lynched. You don't hear much about that. But Black women were also organized and federated associations to address this scourge on society. And they were also advocating for the vote because they realized without that franchise, they were stymied in every way. And in Virginia in particular, when you think about on the eve of the Civil War, 1860, at least 500,000 people were enslaved, many of them women and children, because slave owners preferred to have women and children on plantations. Not only would women work, but they could reproduce as well. And the children could be sold, but worked until they were sold. And so to think about monuments being erected of men who enslaved people and raped women, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to reckon with. And even now, I have some conflict about it because to remove them, I understand the reasons, and in many ways I do agree with them, but how do we teach that part of our history? And I know what it feels like to have one's history diminished and dismissed and seemingly erased. Still, there must be some way that we can come to a consensus about how this history should be taught. I'm really grateful for the work of my colleague, Dr. Nicole Mauritania. She's associate professor at the University of Richmond, just released a book called Confederate Exceptionalism and Civil War Myth and Memory in the 21st Century. If you have an opportunity, take a look at that. Nicole Mauritania, Confederate Exceptionalism, Civil War Myth and Memory in the 21st Century, published by the University Press of Kansas. It gives a much fuller understanding of how neo-Confederates can reckon with this changing landscape and all of those who value our history, not only Confederate history, but all of American history. I was not a fan of history, but my mother was a collector. And I want to show you something that she collected. And we all said, oh, Mother. These are Confederate medallions made out of pewter that she had framed with a short biographical sketch about each of them. Because she appreciated the artwork. It wasn't so much about the Confederate history, but the artwork that went into making this art. And so this was something that was in the home, in my home, and helped me to appreciate art from a different perspective. But as I think about the disparities in our society now, you look in every sector, education, health, employment, housing. What does it mean to have such disparities while you have such massive monuments to men that would have kept my people enslaved? How do we reckon with that? Is there any reckoning? And how do we teach our children empathy when we have such division about our history? I open that up to you.
Thank you. We are actually a little bit past where I thought we would be time-wise, so I may cut out a few of my questions in order to make more room for our the questions coming from our members of the audience. But I did want to ask a few questions, and the first one I wanted to start with was with regard to the kind of conservation background idea of respecting the original intent. In this case, of course, the original intent is very different from what a lot of the modern day stakeholders would value. And so how do we reconcile the needs of the current stakeholders with the original intent of the people who had these sculptures commissioned? Who wants to start? I'll let Christina start.
I was gonna say, I'll jump in here. I think not only does the Valentine Museum have so many other original artworks by Edward Valentine that we can pivot to discuss his original intent, but also the city of Richmond is structurally, architecturally, a living monument to white supremacy. You cannot walk down the street and not understand the legacy of being the capital of the Confederacy. So, and to pivot away from that, and allow us to delve into the lingering effects, the effects that are still, as Lauranett mentioned, still so present in our education system, our medical systems, that we just think it's a good idea for us to focus on the contemporary side of these objects, and hopefully continue to give voice to the critics of public art, and allow them that space and that opportunity to do so.
Let me add also that in some ways, I can look at the way we could use Confederate monuments as a citywide public museum that interacts with other monuments around the city. We have a new Maggie Walker statue. We have the Kehinde Wiley Rumors of War. We have Civil Rights Monument on Capitol Square, and all of the other monuments that's around the story, around the city. How can we use those monuments in a much more synergetic way, synthesis, you know what I'm trying to say, way, so that we can weave in the different stories to help people understand how it is we became who we are. You know, like, for example, when I think about the Confederate monuments, I want to know, who were the people that were enslaved? What families do we know that come from those places where the enslavers built their wealth? How can we help descendants find their ancestors? Through study of those who enslaved. Flip the script, turn it around. Let me also add, I'm a Baptist, so I'm warming up now. I served on the Mayor's Monument Commission. And initially, we were told that we were to look at contextualization and removal. After Charlottesville, we were told to consider removal. In the process, though, we met with community groups throughout the city, in evenings and weekends when it was convenient for people to meet with us to hear what they had to say. It was like a listening tour. We gathered all that we had learned in a report, and there is also a website at the American Civil War Museum on Monument Ave, I think it's called, so you can still have access to that. And so when we submitted the report, it was to relocate the Jefferson Davis Monument to Hollywood Cemetery and contextualize the other monuments. That did not happen. For me, and perhaps for others, I'll speak for myself though, it was very disheartening not to have any of our recommendations taken up. We put that was service. That was volunteer work. That was time away from family and friends and life itself, because we believed in what we were doing. And to have the monuments, to have the decision made to remove the monuments in the way that it just was very disheartening. I think that could have been, I know that could have been done better. And I understand that many of the monuments are at a wastewater treatment plant. That's not right. That's not right. I just don't believe in that. That's somebody's history. And though my history was not treated with respect, I would not do that to someone else.
So could I have a minute? Two things. One, I think that from the conservation point of view, this is why the American Institute for Conservation has created a contested monuments working group to help conservators have a guidance document to help them understand their new role when it comes to monuments like this. And so in a way, all of this is very new for conservators, this idea of what our role is in this conversation and what how we include these larger groups of the local communities in these conversations of preservation is something that we're still struggling with. I do want to say something about the monuments being at the water treatment plant. We had concerns as well, and some of our understanding is that there's a certain amount of security at a water waste treatment plant in Richmond that is hard to accommodate at other places because it's considered part of Homeland Security to protect the water sources. So while it's not, I was also incredibly frustrated when I heard that. We came to understand that it had to do with this idea that there was a certain amount of protection that the monuments needed now that they were down. And so while I agree that it's not ideal, there was some logic there. So I thought I'd just throw that out there as well. Hopefully that helps.
And I'll add that the ones that were brought down by protesters are not at the wastewater treatment plant. They are in a city warehouse somewhere.
Rob, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, not directly on that question, but I will point to recent New York Times coverage of two historic cemeteries in Richmond, Evergreen Cemetery, where Maggie Walker is buried, and so is John Mitchell, incredibly important people in American history, and East End Cemetery immediately adjacent. So it's appropriate, I think, to think about the original intent of those who created the Confederate memorials. But I think we also have to invest now, after having failed to invest for generations. We have to invest now in the preservation of monuments that were erected at that same time period in Evergreen and East End. And those are just two examples of African-American cemeteries that are in dire need of assistance. Thank you.
Thanks for mentioning that, Rob. I know that Delegate Dolores McQuinn has really pushed to make a difference in that area and has received funding to assist African-American cemeteries.
So I'm going to see if Gwen can check in and see if there are any questions that have come into her.
I have not seen any yet outside of just a reminder that this is being recorded, and it is our hope to share at least a portion of this in the near future on our social media channels and website.
Okay. Now we have very little time and I have to sort of guess which questions we should ask next. But I think because we are the Washington Conservation Guild, And there have been questions about sculptures within the District of Columbia, and kind of similar issues in areas in the North having to do with things that are not Confederate, but where there are ethical questions relating to the audience and the original intent and the current stakeholders in those communities, in particular the Emancipation sculpture in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure that all of you are familiar with some of the debates surrounding those things, as well as the Robert Gould Shaw statue and honoring the U.S. colored troops in the 54th Massachusetts. But in both cases, they kind of, in their modern day interpretation, they're perceived as sort of a white savior narrative, and they're somewhat condescending. And that's the current perception. But of course, in the case of the Emancipation sculpture in Washington, D.C., it was actually funded by freedmen. And so the original intent was not to be condescending, but this is how we're interpreting it today. So I'd like to hear what people have to say about some of these Union and abolitionist sculptures and the way that we perceive them differently today. Do you want to go first, Christina?
Sure. If the sculptures in Richmond had not been taken down, the Valentine was actively working to contribute to their contextualization, and working with the Monument Avenue Commission to consider ways in which a new layer could be added that might enhance or connect us a little bit better to that original intent. I'm so sorry, I'm not intimately familiar with all of those works in Washington, D.C., but I do think that there is a moment where we can work with designers, historians, architects, social activists, and craft that layer of context. And it might just be in the form of metal panels that can be changed in the future. But I do think that there is always an opportunity to add context and help foster conversation, civil discourse.
And we have sorry, Lauranett.
I agree with you, Christina. And in fact, that's one of the things I try to promote in the classroom. I've taught leadership and the humanities, and also public history. And one of the things I encourage my students to do is to have civic discussions about the world that surrounds us, particularly public history, and particularly in this moment. And so they're able to think about these monuments and the history that surrounds them in a way that they had not before, because we're all focused on this subject and looking at the ways that public history can make a difference, and being more inclusive and diversifying the public history that we see. You'll notice you rarely see monuments to women, actually. Why is that when we're at least half of the population? And in fact, Charlotte Scott was the freedwoman from Virginia who gave her first earnings in freedom to the Emancipation statue. We know very little about her, though. Why is that? We give short shrift to women's contributions. I think that's an area that we need to know more about, and that we need to have more conversations about.
Thank you. Josephine? Oh, sorry.
Gwen, are you managing the raised hands? I see some raised hands.
Yes. And we have a question for Josephine Shea. Raised her hand, was patiently awaiting. I do believe I unmuted her. But in the meantime, I'll turn to Nora Hyman. Apologies too if I'm mispronouncing any names. Thanks for your patience. Nora, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to make just a super quick comment, and that is that in the case of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was indeed paid for by emancipated slaves, it wasn't, I don't think it's a modern recontextualization of it to see the sculptures being problematic. If you go back and read, it's available, you can download it tonight while we're watching if you've got a second screen. You know, Frederick Douglass's oration, which makes it really clear at the inauguration of this memorial that that the memorial itself is problematic. It wasn't what they hoped it would be, and that Lincoln in a way is being lionized. That while it was great that he helped to emancipate the slaves, he could have done it sooner and better, and that it's wrong to kind of turn him into some kind of a savior of the Black people, which is how he's being portrayed. So it makes for a really fascinating read, and I think it's really helpful to understand that, you know, for those of us, you know, I'm an historian interested in French sculpture. I work on Mercier, so you know, my heartstrings are pulled when I imagine the sculpture coming down, and yet at this time, I ardently want it to come down because I understand the ways in which it stands for a kind of white supremacy, which is, you know, absolutely not what we would wish for this day and age. So anyway, that's really all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we?
Go ahead, Belinda.
No, I was going to kick it back to Gwen. If you
Yes.
Could, yeah.
Yes. Greg Bailey, I see you have a raised hand, and I have unmuted you.
Thank you. Hi, this is Greg. I live in Baltimore, which also has a fraught history with monuments. And a number of them were removed by the city in the wake of the Baltimore uprising now 5 years ago. And in particular, in my neighborhood, the Roger B. Taney monument was taken out of the square. And I, purely by happenstance, happened to be there that evening as it left. But what surprised me, and perhaps in looking back this wasn't surprising, was the sort of spontaneous outpouring of music and installation art and people taking photographs and the signs that were left at the empty plinth in the weeks and the months that followed. And I know that as conservators, we tend to focus on the object, the statue, the monument that is removed. But my question to our speakers is, do you have thoughts about how the space, the locations of these statues and monuments can be used to continue to address this history of pain, this current moment, kind of lived memory, and the way that we continue to understand and recontextualize the objects themselves?
I remember on the Monument Commission, we heard from people who suggested having international artists to come in to install art depicting various subjects, but particularly around this idea of history and the hard history. And there were actually quite a few people that seemed to appreciate that idea of having international artists in, particularly when you think about the tourist dollars that it could generate.
Yeah, I would say that as we move forward with transforming those spaces that once were the setting of oppressive monumentation, that we think about non-permanent uses of those spaces, that rather than assume that whatever we put there next has to be there forever. Some of the work, I think in Baltimore, someone was using one of the pedestals with a paper mache statue, which I think it was Baltimore, which I thought was brilliant because yes, it expresses something, but it's also inherently impermanent, as are we all. So it seems to me that that's something that we should allow ourselves to think. Thank you.
Kate, are you going to talk about MDP Circle?
Wait, sorry?
Can I just share my screen real quick, y'all? So the Lee circle, I love this question because it is just about space. So so Lee Circle that is surrounding the Robert E. Lee statue in Plinth has been taken over as a community space. It is this fabulous place where you can go, you can register to vote, you can learn about how to be a good social activist, how you can really give back to Richmond. There are wonderful monuments to those who have lost their lives to police brutality, and really they're created handicapped access that wasn't originally provided by the city. There's barbecues there, there's basketball there on the weekends. It is now also a tourist attraction. You see these light installations. It's just been a phenomenally active community space that has been really taken over fairly organically after it was also the site of significant police brutality in June and July. So sorry, Kate, I just had to I get all excited.
And
no, you're fine.
Christina, like before you speak again, Kate, just because she used the initials, it's Marcus David Peters, right? So instead of just MDP,
Oh, yeah.
for people who don't live in Richmond or aren't familiar with the case.
Yeah. I think I had some of that art in my lecture, and there's a great article in My Modern Met that has a lot of his projections on there. I think the problem with saying what's going to happen with Lee is that until the judge makes his decision in October, we don't know what's happening with Lee. So I think that it's one of those things where the city of Richmond and the state of Virginia will likely have a lot of community input into what happens. There's continuing discussions as to the pedestals and will they stay or will they go. You're talking about a lot of granite. And so I wish I had, I don't think there's any permanent, like there's no current answer, especially to Robert E. Lee, because for all we know, he's not gonna move. So yeah, I don't know. I think I personally think the projections are really great though, and everything that's going on there is really great, but we'll see what the judge has to say in October. October 19th, I think, is the start of that hearing.
Right, we've got a question from Jeremy Wells. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you right now.
Thank you. So I had a question about orthodox or conventional conservation theory and doctrine, if that might be somehow interfering with our ability to respond in an ethical and just way to the issues around Confederate monuments, keeping in mind that the conservation doctrine that we've all been trained in, especially object conservators, is largely based on Western white men. A lot of Italians in there, you know, Carbonera, Baldini, Brandy, right? These are probably familiar names. There are no women's names in that list. There are certainly no names from people who are not white. So the question again to the panelists is that, I mean, I think we can assume it's probably some sort of a barrier to some extent. And how do we overcome that? And it relates to, I think Kate made this mention that for object conservators, that this idea of engaging with local communities is a new thing. How do we piece this together in order to create a more just practice?
Yeah, I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion for a while. I think this idea of including communities in community sculpture is new. I think the contested working group is coming out with a statement, but then that group I think is hoping that there will be also then guidelines to help people figure out ways to have that conversation, figure out how to understand the conservators' role in that conversation, how to help communities understand the totality of what the monument means, what moving the monument means, or anything really, anything that's considered public art in a public space. And so I think that for people who've been in conservation a long time, like I have, it is really a hard pivot to make, to start having these conversations and trying to figure out where your opinions belong. For me as a state employee, I have a certain amount of neutrality that I just have to maintain because people have to feel comfortable coming to me with their history. And as a conservator, I still think that is very important, that people trust us to consider history in all its forms to be important and something that needs to be protected. So it's an ongoing and very interesting, I think, ethical conversation that I think has only just really started. I hope that hopefully that helped answer your question a little bit.
Yeah, I like Jeremy's question, and it's also a key question for the historic preservation movement as a whole. Look, the orthodoxy of historic preservation, let's say it's a question of integrity, right? We can't honor places that haven't maintained their integrity. So that leaves out like a whole swath of American history. Some places neglected, therefore lost their integrity. Some places intentionally erased, therefore lost their integrity. And I'll just say that I think those of us who are working now in these fields, this should shape our careers. This should be the time that we take risks to align what we do every day with the work of justice. There's a reckoning, and we as professionals in these fields have a responsibility to engage them. So thank you, Jeremy, for that question.
And Jeremy, I really like that question too, because I think it speaks to getting at sharing more, right? Sharing more. Oversharing is not bad in many cases. And speaking specifically about the Valentine Museum, we were founded as a museum of art and Western civilization. So there's all kinds of racism to unpack there that we helped perpetuate. Edward Valentine was the museum's first president. He was this sculptor that helped create the symbolism of the lost cause here in Richmond. And I think being open about how our institution has contributed to the way that the city, the issues that the city is still wrestling with, I mean, I think we need to reinsert ourselves into that narrative. It's not that we're not being, unneutral or biased, but I think it's just being honest about what our institution has done in the past so that we can then look to the future and hopefully start with a slate. It won't be blank, but a slate to start with.
Okay, Karen French, another Baltimore area conservator. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you or ask you to unmute.
Yes, I just wanted to make a point to the idea of what might happen after monuments have come down. As a Brit, just to look to what has actually been happening in Trafalgar Square for a while that people might not know about. So we have Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, and then there are 4 statue plinths, and one was always empty because there was never the money to put the equestrian statue there that was supposed to go. So it was empty for about 150 years, and then in the late 90s, artists finally got to the point where they realized this was a great opportunity, and for the last decade or so, 2 decades, there's been kind of competitions of people submitting ideas to actually put something up that's a temporary piece on the plinth. So they get a period and they kind of rotate it around. And I see in Baltimore and everywhere, as these monuments come down, there's this great opportunity. You have this plinth here and a space to do something permanent, temporary, whatever, but you can really think outside the box and do a lot there. So I hope that that might help people to understand, it won't just be a big empty space. If something comes down, you could do something really innovative there afterwards. That's all I had to say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, so much. And that was another thing that I was thinking of recently about the plinth space as well in Richmond. So if we could turn it to, we've got 2 more questions, raised hands here. We have an iPhone. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question. I am unmuting you now. At least I thought I was. If we can turn to Howard quickly, please.
Howard.
I thought I had unmuted.
Okay.
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. A lot of my practice these days is actually in historic cemeteries, in addition to public art. And I'm hearing reports, although I haven't seen it and I haven't been called in on it, for vandalism of individual gravestones of Confederate veterans. And I'm wondering if that falls into a different ethical world in terms of their treatment and recovery than a public monument.
Yes.
How the folks feel about that.
Yeah, there's been, I hadn't heard about the vandalism that you're speaking of, but there was vandalism at 3 cemeteries in Richmond. And it was, whenever it's a space for people who've passed away, any gravestones, cemeteries, anything like that, that is sacred ground, and graffiti does not count as historically worthwhile at that point. So while graffiti on a monument that has something to do with the civil unrest that's currently going on is one thing, desecrating the grave sites of other people is never going to be considered acceptable. Yeah.
There are some gray areas, I'll admit. I work with the state of Maryland on some. They are larger monuments located in graveyards, so there's a kind of a gray area there, but they tend to be marking mass burials, usually group burials of remains that have been repatriated to their hometown, usually.
And they tend to not have been placed there for the same reasons that Monument Avenue was placed there.
Yeah.
And it's more of a memorial and a space to remember those who have fallen. And that is not the same message in general that you're seeing on Monument Avenue.
Although, again, some of these plots do have later monuments added by sons of Confederate veterans or some of those other groups who might be associated with the lost cause. So
right, and
so
there
like
are,
I say, it's an interesting gray area.
It is an interesting gray area, and for the most part, we've been trying to do as much as we can to help remove graffiti that's been showing up in the cemeteries in Richmond. The other interesting gray area is the A.P. Hill Memorial, where he is actually buried under that monument. And so I think people forget that that is actually also a burial, and not because it looks so much like everything else on Monument Avenue. So that if anybody is wondering why that memorial in particular hasn't been removed in the same way that the other Richmond monuments were, it's because there's different regulations for that memorial, and there's another level of protection for that memorial. But I do believe there is some work involved going on right now to have him reburied at a different location.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Sorry, furiously typing in the background. Okay, let's try one more time. We've got somebody who's identified as an iPhone. I'm trying to ask you to unmute. And it doesn't look, I can't take it over since it is an iPhone. I did get a question to come in that might be an interesting thing to discuss. It's something that I've thought about in the past. Copies and smaller versions and 3D scans of monuments that the public and the community would consider offensive and should be moved from a public space. How do we address the copies? Is it enough just to make a smaller copy of something and then reuse those materials or that space with didactics to explain how was this space used previously, but put it in a more sensitive context today?
I think the idea about monuments is their scale, right? And it's very hard to misinterpret walking up to Robert E. Lee or the pillar at the Jefferson Davis Monument that had Vindictrix on the top. You know, the size of it was meant to impose, was meant to oppress. and to reinforce all of the other structures that had been created to create racial oppression. So I do think the idea of having them smaller, and this was one of the ideas that came out of our exhibit in 2019, was to lower. So having them at a lower level, and if you're looking down on them, it's a new way. If we get the Jefferson Davis statue, we will be displaying him on his back the way that he was found in the street in June of 2020. So I love that idea of reducing 3D models. You know, plastic's a lot safer outside. Yeah, I'll be interested to hear what Kate and Lauranett and Rob have to say.
I just want to add something real quickly. I've got a 7 o'clock I've got to get into, but I like the idea of having Jefferson Davis on his back, because that is not the way that we have seen monuments. That's not the way you think of great men on their backs. And it gives us a different way to think about this history, this Confederate history, and Virginia history, actually. When you think about Virginia as being the mother of presidents, it's never really mentioned that most of them were slaveholders. And we think of them as the great men who made this state. So to have Jefferson Davis on his back sends a strong statement, I think. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Lauranett, for joining us. I know that she has a panel coming up at 7 p.m. on Black women suffragists. Is that correct?
Yes.
So busy.
Thanks for staying with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Good to be with you.
If anyone else wants to comment on that, I just wanted to make sure we thanked Lauranett before she went to her next meeting.
I will say we did try and do a 3D scan of Robert E. Lee so that that could be made available for anyone who wanted to access it. And unfortunately, there were technical issues that made that fail. But I do think there's a lower resolution 3D scan out there. But we haven't thought about replicating it. It was mostly as a recording the condition and recording him in the current location as opposed to wherever he ends up. So.
Yeah, and I'll only add that there's an extraordinary public conversation going on right now about how to memorialize the history of Shockoe Bottom, where virtually all evidence, there's some archaeological evidence that survives, but virtually all evidence has been removed. So whether it's to create some kind of, recreation of the industry of slave market there or not, these kinds of really hard conversations are happening and are centered in Shockoe Bottom and focus on a part of American history that we have ignored, African American history, and the harshest aspects of it. Preservationists are focusing on oppression and cruelty and endurance but also achievement and activism and the positive side that say Madam C.J. Walker and her Villa Lawaro in Irvington, New York, a place that has both been preserved, restored, and repurposed again to help with lifting up entrepreneurs, in particular African-American women. So there are really hard questions, some of them as deeply philosophical as this question about copies, which I think is fantastic. Thanks.
I'll also add that there is a copy of Jefferson Davis by Edward Valentine somewhere in New Orleans. It was removed from being on view. He created it 2 years after. So if you want one, you can get the New Orleans one. The Valentine one's the one that was on Monument Avenue.
All right, and I think we've got somebody, I've now unmuted the iPhone. Is that person available? I think not. I'm going to have to mute the man since we are over time. Belinda, I'll let you make the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is our, I guess, really our first regular presentation under the virtual format that we're following. And I've just been really pleased to hear the questions that we've had. And I'm really grateful to our presenters, Rob Newig, Kate Ridgway, Christina Vida, and Lauranett Lee. And I want to make sure, and I'm going to ask, let's see if maybe unmute Jane, because I'm not sure what the next meeting topic is.
So our next meeting in November is going to be Tammy Hong, who will be giving the talk that she was going to give in, goodness, this just seems like years ago. April, when we've had to go into lockdown. So she has very graciously agreed to reschedule, and I deeply apologize. I don't remember the title of your talk, Tammy, but that we'll be sending announcements out about that very soon. And I really hope that you can all turn out and for Tammy's talk. So, and thank you all so much for being here. This is really wonderful, and what an amazing discussion. Terrific speakers. This is so important. Really, really enjoyed it. So I just want to thank everybody for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. This was great.
You're welcome, and good night, everyone.
Good night, and drive safely if you're driving. I'm not.
You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Bye, everyone.